record to local computer. Yes, there you go. You're doing it. I can say super champion. All right, so I'm just going to do a very quick session here on Frankenstein, 10-15 minutes max, maybe only 10 minutes, because we've got lots of detail in the lecture stuff today. And there's some good supporting stuff on YouTube, and I want us to get on a break in about 10 minutes. So I think we could do with that. So I'm going to have a little quick shifty through. I'm looking at some of the original texts here. I could have also brought in all sorts of stuff. Christian just mentioned the Frankenstein Chronicles. There's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, done by Kenneth Branagh from 1994. There's plenty of updated versions of it. And then, which might be worth looking at and engaging with if you're finding it a little bit sort of stodgy and archaic. Though funnily enough, it's really not for a text of its time. No, there's a lot worse. And there's also a lot of new, fiction that's coming out that's really just sort of reproduces the Frankenstein story, very much indeed. Anything where a man builds a robot, anything where sort of AI, they all sort of tell a very similar story of a creator normally and his creation that sort of mimics sort of, God and Adam in the original story, and here as well, when Frankenstein sort of makes his monster, he sort of injects life through like batteries and sort of electricity, galvanic processes, but what he gets is something quite opposite and unexpected. He doesn't get an automaton. He gets a noble creature who is seen as a monster. That's the frontispiece from the 1831 second edition there, in which the monster looks strangely like a sort of a pile of sort of stuff in the bottom of the room there. No, it's not, or is it? It must be the monster because he's so muscly. His head is slightly misplaced on his shoulders, but he doesn't look too horrific, and yet it does look like sort of skeletal fingers and arms, and yet he's got this sort of book he's reading, rather like his maker. He's quite literary, and it is a book about sort of literariness and about romanticism. It was quickly made into a play as well, as you can see here from this rather dashing and romantic episode going on the right there, with a romantic drama is what's important to think about with Frankenstein. It is romanticism, and we'll have a little recap of what romanticism is later on in the session. Well, we had Hobbes, we had empiricism and the sort of rationality, and then we moved on to romanticism with Rousseau last time. And this is, a typical Gothic and Romantic text, and we'll touch on that as we go along. We can think about why it is that, in terms of it's strongly Gothic, and we can see that first of all from that the sentence I pointed out from which it all starts, where it sort of uses these sort of very strongly Gothic settings. Not only is there the Arctic wilds and wastes from the frame narrative, because it's framed in a series of letters, and then in the meeting with the ship's captain, as he's pursuing the monster out onto the sort of the Arctic ice flows, and it's the Northwest Passage that they're trying to navigate. But there's also the settings up in Mont Blanc, which Mary Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, had written about. And those are sort of this meeting with nature, where nature is kind of like very beautiful, but also very scary. And that's known as the sublime. So we've got a very strongly sort of romantic and Gothic setting. Another thing that is strongly important in both Romanticism and the Gothic is this idea of sort of medievalism, and it's being contrasted with, juxtaposed with sort of modernity. So you've got this idea of sort of science, and yet we then go back to this sort of very Gothic Ingolstadt and the university, which is a medieval university, and these sort of old dank castles and mountains. Um, and so it looks back to a sort of a world, a medieval world as well at the same time, that's kind of disappeared. And yet the romance element is sort of drawing upon these medieval elements, and yet they've become a form of kind of entertainment, if you will, to look back at safely from a new modern age where science is bringing a lot of progress. But in terms of Frankenstein, I guess you could say that sort of Shelley takes that element of modernity, the scientific, and sort of makes it almost into something quite medieval and gothic. Uh, and it's also got very strong themes all the way through it of power, in terms of we've got the Victor Frankenstein, who's the mad scientist, or the sort of romantic trope of the mad scientist. It's alive, who's created something beyond his power, and sexual power as well. Somebody was just mentioning it. Was it Melito Borhild? I can't remember. About this sort of the idea of the bride that's very strong within it, because the monster obviously realizes that he's on his own in the world, and through his reading he recognizes, and through observing the family, the de Lacys, um, that that he needs a partner, otherwise he is entirely alone, particularly since his creator seems to have disowned him. So the story is, if we look at story or plot, it's plotted strongly within a frame narrative with letters of a reconstructed tale. It's a tale within a tale, and it's got that sort of feel of travel writing, where there's authenticity lent it through the letters and the scene setting of the frame. And yet within it, we've got a strongly romantic Gothic tale, where I suppose we could say, what kind of story is it? Um, and it could be a story of overcoming the monster, though the question could be who's the monster, of course, in all this. That's one of a classic, we'll have a look at that as well, typology of stories, where there are 7 basic types of stories. Is it a tragedy as well? And if so, who is the tragic figure? Is it the monster, or is it Victor? It's quite difficult to tell. So is it an inverted tragedy? Is it a form of tragedy? Is it a plot story of overcoming the monster? Of course, it's also, to a degree, a romance and a love story. Now, lots of you, I can sense out there as well, are kind of like, wow, this is a pretty dated book. And I can agree with that. I can understand that at certain points and passages it is dated. And if you think it's dated, then you should look at the sources where it comes from, because obviously it draws really heavily on biblical tradition. But for me, as also I was a Middle Eastern scholar when I was young, it also draws really strongly on another interesting story, which is the Yiddish and Kabbalah-based story of the golem. And if you're wondering who the golem is, you can think Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. The golem story is this is a page from a very early text of Sefer Yetzirah. I know that I'm saying that correctly because I do speak Hebrew, which is this idea of, if you use ancient Kabbalic mystical traditions, mostly numerology based on the 22 letters of the Hebrew language. This is actually in the outtake from Agatha Paluch's bit on this as well, that it's possible to basically, Sefer Yetzirah means the book of creation, to the effect of, I'm reading here from the last few lines, creating a golem, giving a name to a golem was believed to animate and control its body, and conversely, erasing the name would annihilate the creature. And it was a sort of a book, a revenant, rather likely DiCaprio's 19th century sort of back to the primitive film, The Revenant, based on a book as well. The golem was a sort of revenge monster that was created, but obviously the golem generally always went wrong. because man couldn't mimic the sort of actor creation that's in the Bible. And that's definitely one of the strongest sort of drawing points for Shelley in this book. Just going to check on time as well, so I don't sort of bang on. I've got quite a few things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go a little bit quicker. I'll just look at themes now, and I think then we'll go for a little break. There are pictures here from an actual, this is from the British Library. These are galvanic experiments, and you see these rather sort of strange, levitating, disembodied hands that are coming in, and presumably you can see sort of frog's legs down here on the bench. And this is the famous frog experiment, where they believe that electricity might be the spark of life that is put mystically into the golem by the Jewish mystic in his revenge plot, or by God into Adam in the special creation. Shelley was at these lectures in London and was obviously drew upon this very, very strongly. There were sort of experiments where body snatchers used to go out to graves and they would dig up bodies, or they would try and purchase the bodies of murderers who'd been executed at Newgate Prison in London. And so you get this very macabre, very gothic sort of scenario where doctors, experimenters would be sort of paying these body snatchers to go out and get parts. And you can see already there's this sort of idea of Frankenstein is sort of germinating at that time. You can go today, maybe even if you're coming to York, which we'll discuss finally next week. There's the Hunterian Museum in London, which has been closed for a bit but should be reopened by spring, where they display some of the parts from this very macabre process. So I think I heard, Louise, you were talking about the sort of science in the book, and it's very, very strong as a source, but it sort of then is used as a springboard to think about sort of very major themes and questions about human existence, which is typically romantic rather than rationalistic, like we had at the time of Crusoe and Gulliver. There was a very strong interest in science and sort of material things. But here it's romantic fiction. Here is asking the big questions. We've got this the Bride of Frankenstein, the Adam and Eve story, floating through it, just like we've seen in the Scarlet Letter, for example, where we've got this sort of replaying of sort of the Eve story with the original sin. It's also very strong, of course, as we're going to see in Jane Eyre, girl who's a liar and her way is deceit. So this theme very, very strong through most romantic literature, and it's the part of the story that is the romance. We've also got this. I'm going to break after this slide. The romantic hero should be potentially a capital R there. The romantic hero, I think we touched on already. I had that picture of, I think it's in down there as well, of Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights looking tormented. And we don't know who is the hero or the anti-hero in this story, because the monster, as we saw from that first frontispiece, is a collection of body parts, probably from murderers, but he's reading literature and thinking noble thoughts, and the monster is very much noble, but obviously his appearance is making him ignoble, and so we have this sort of sense of the noble hero who, on the face of it, like we've had Rochester will have in Jane Eyre, who we think maybe aren't they're sort of more sort of gothic possible sort of antagonists, but they are heroes that just don't look it on the outside. And then finally, before, because we need a break, there's the question of what is a monster? Is it the scientist who makes him? Who is the monster in this story? And to all intents and purposes, that's one of the hanging questions that you could see here. You could see it in children's books in the Gruffalo. You could see it in most stories, like if, for example, you look at I, Robot with Will Smith, based on Isaac Asimov. There, the creator is more the monster, and the robot who's created and infused with artificial intelligence through algorithms becomes more human than the human subject involved. And this is drawing on the Golem story, where the person who tries to reenact God's act of creation is obviously not God, and therefore full of human jealousy. Okay, it's quarter past. That's an hour and 15 in. That means it's a high time for a break. So I'm going to go over to the text wall. Louise, thank you very much for that. If you can stop recording for the moment.